Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. My name's Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the Haley Public Library. So I hope that by the end of this presentation tonight that we as a library will achieve our mission to inspire discovery, connection, learning, and growth in our community. For Art Talks, the world of Jane Austen, art, fashion, and eligible gentlemen. Kathryn Zupsic has been an art educator for over 25 years, working as a docent and lecturer for the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, the DeYoung Museum, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She specializes in modern art, from Frida Kahlo to pop art to the fine art of the tattoo. And this is our fourth lecture, I think. They're all posted on our website. I invite you to check them out. They're really wonderful lectures. So Kathryn is a native of Portland. She has a degree in Spanish and Latin American literature from the University of Oregon and a diploma from La Varenne, a renowned cooking school in Paris. She and her husband divide their time between Ketchum and a farm in Glens Ferry, Idaho. So please join me in welcoming Kathryn Zupsic. And thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here because what I talk about is art for the art museums in San Francisco, generally. But one day I was in the British Gallery and I noticed that everything, 80% of the art in this British Gallery was made during Jane Austen's lifetime because she just happened to live right in the great golden age of British art, which wasn't very long. So we can look at all the artwork from that era as characters. They were mostly doing portraits. So that's how I got the idea to do this. Combining Jane Austen and art is just like my dream. So here she is, 1775 to 1817. She is by far Britain's most famous and beloved female writer, but we know almost nothing about her. She lived only to be 41 years old. She lived a very quiet life just in this southern part of England, in these few towns, villages there, and she never got married. So she just lived her whole life with her parents, and then after her parents died, with one of her brothers. These are the 6 novels that she wrote in the order in which she wrote them. And she wrote these novels without her name appearing on a single one of them because she died before her name was on them because it was simply not acceptable for a lady, she's classified as a lady, part of the gentry, to write for money or for the public. Just for your family is all that would have been okay. So these are, amazingly, her books have never been out of print. In 210 years, all 6 of them. That's just unheard of. There are just a few others. Dracula has never been out of print. Pilgrim's Progress. There's just this little list of books, but all 6 of hers have never been. And she's had big bursts in popularity and then times when she's not quite so popular, but in our time, in the last 50 years, she's been outrageously popular. And so these are just some of the movies and television programs that have been made from her books. And as you mentioned when we were chatting before, the greatest actors of the time play these roles. There's Sir Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson in the first Pride and Prejudice, then Colin Firth. I actually think that was about the first time we saw him, was when he was in that, the first time we saw him in the United States. And then of course Keira Knightley in the more recent. Gwyneth Paltrow, it just goes on and on and on, the high level of stars in these shows. And then a younger group of filmmakers have picked this up too, making all sorts of, have you seen this? Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. So that's Elizabeth there with her, they all have weapons and fighting the undead. There's one in an Australian film called, no, it's a book, Pride and Platypus. She appears now on the British 10-pound note, which is a huge deal because before that, for many, many years, it was Charles Darwin. And before that, it was Queen Elizabeth. So it's a huge distinction. And, you know, as you all know, because you're big fans, she writes about a small world. This is the advice she gave to her niece who wanted to be a novelist. 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. So she doesn't really talk about the world outside. But what was happening in the world outside during her life was really amazing. First, England lost the colonies, the American colonies in the American Revolutionary War. Then, right across the channel, they had to witness the French Revolution. This is a painting of King Louis XVI being executed at the guillotine, which of course was just terrifying for the upper classes of England to watch this happening. And then Napoleon took over in France, and they had to battle him again for 10 years, which posed a major threat to the British Isles. Napoleon did. It was also the Industrial Revolution up in the north of England, and which was changing. New money was just pouring in, people who did not have this classification as gentlemen and ladies. And the same thing was happening in the colonies, where people were making a lot of money in the British colonies in the Caribbean, where they had slaves for quite a while. So that was another source of new wealth in England. So this is just what I wanted to show you when I walked. These are just a few of the paintings that were in the Legion of Honor gallery in San Francisco that were made during her lifetime. Notice the red coats, because England was at war for just about her. That's red coat means army. Navy blue coat is Navy. England was at war for almost Jane Austen's entire lifetime. So just a little bit of background. The entire 1700s in England is called the Georgian era. And that's just because every king during that whole 100-year period was named George. And King George III was king for Jane Austen's entire life. These are individual portraits of King George up there in the far left, his wife, Queen Charlotte, and 13 of their 16 beautiful children. I mean, look how attractive they all are. When King George got to be a little older, George IV was the heir to the throne, but he had to rule in his father's place as a regent. That means his father was still alive, but he had been having these bouts of madness and could not continue. There's a great movie called The Madness of King George with Helen Mirren playing his wife. Fantastic movie that shows that whole thing. So the period that he ruled as a regent before he became the king is called the Regency era. And that's important because Jane Austen wrote her novels during this Regency era. So it's the styles, the specific clothing and manners and all the style of the Regency era that applies to her books. Anybody know why I'm showing this? Those children in the front row are George and Charlotte. So those are family names. If this little guy becomes king, he will be George VII. So the art scene in England in the 1700s, even before that, in the 1500s, 1600s, was really dismal. They just didn't have good artists. They had to import their artists from outside of England. So these are two examples. Hans Holbein, the younger, was from Germany, his famous portrait of Henry VIII. And then Anthony van Dyck was from Flanders, which today is Belgium. And so he also did a lot of court paintings. And it's Anthony van Dyck that these new up-and-coming British painters are going to imitate. So let's look at this. This is his painting of the king, King Charles. He invented the informal, formal portrait. And you can see just what I mean. He's outside, which is a very informal setting. But he's standing very regally. We know that he's important. Van Dyck was also very famous for really flattering whoever he was painting. The king was well under 5 feet tall, really short. So Van Dyck hasn't exactly lied about how tall he is, but he's done certain things to make him look taller. He has the horse bowing down to him, so you can't tell how much shorter he is than that horse. He's got the groomsmen back in the background, so again, we can't perceive their relatives' heights. And then look at that horizon line. It's really low, which makes him look taller and more majestic. The English, by the way, this is one of my favorite things about Jane Austen's books and about all English art. They just appreciated their landscape, their countryside, from so early on. If this were a French portrait, the French who were considered much more sophisticated artists, but they would have surrounded an important person with their important things, a beautiful room, beautifully furnished, and things like that. But not the English. They like to show people outside. So, King George III in the mid-1700s decided that they had to start training artists in England. And so they opened the Royal Academy of the Art, which was a school, but also twice a year they would have these enormous exhibitions that would show all the English artists, and people would even rich people would bring their old master paintings from Germany or from other places, from France, and they'd hang them all up, so it was as if the whole country was being educated about art. And this is an actual drawing from this time. You can see, so everybody went to these. Jane Austen always went, twice a year, exhibitions, she never missed them. She had a brother in London that she could stay with. And so at this particular one, you can see the king and Queen Charlotte and all of their children have come to see this. They painted, they did engravings like this almost every time there were exhibitions, and so of course art historians just love these now because there are a lot of famous paintings that you can recognize up there on the walls. So the first president of the Royal Academy of the Arts and the most influential person in arts in England was Joshua Reynolds. Here you see him at 25 years old. These are self-portraits. I love that portrait. It's as if he's trying to envision his future. He's holding his paintbrushes and looking out there. And then this painting when he's 57 years old, at the height of his fame and influence, painting himself dressed like Rembrandt with a bust of Michelangelo bowing to him. He was not a modest man. So he had been, as a young man, to Rome. And was the style in Rome, and actually in France as well. Enormous paintings of important, high-minded subjects. History. This would be a reference to the ancient world of Greece or Rome, classical. So important. So these are Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. And this is what he wanted the students at the academy to learn how to paint. But the problem was the English people didn't want these paintings. They just wanted portraits of themselves, especially since a lot of them were becoming really rich out there in the, with the Industrial Revolution. So Reynolds comes up with this really clever idea. He starts making portraits in the grand manner. So this is a portrait of a real lady, but he has dressed her up like an ancient Roman lady. So you can see the Roman arch up there. This dress it's just a made up kind of Roman gown, no real dress that would have existed. And she is making a sacrifice to the three graces who are in charge of bestowing beauty. So Reynolds, just like Van Dyck, always wanted to flatter. So his sitters, so basically the fact that she's sacrificing means that they have endowed her with great beauty. When you see Legion there, that means that it's in the San Francisco Legion of Honor. And those paintings are always up. So if you go to San Francisco sometimes, you'd be able to see a lot of what I'm showing you. So this is another one that Reynolds did. These are big, 7 feet tall, so really life-size. It's a life-size portrait of her. So, informal, formal portrait, right? He's copying Van Dyck. She's outside. Has he flattered her, would you say? Nobody has legs that long or a waist that tiny. He's really flattered her. And can you tell that she's rich? Look at that cape. Ermine, velvet, just thrown across what's probably a really dirty sculpture out there in the garden. And then he's also, what is on that sculpture is important. This is a Greek myth, Paris, the myth of Paris, this is what started the Trojan War. He had to choose who was the most beautiful of three goddesses, and he's supposed to hand an apple to the most beautiful. So you see him there handing an apple, but there are only two goddesses, and he's handing the apple to her, the woman being painted. So, as you can imagine, people just lined up around the block. Everybody wanted to have their portrait painted by Reynolds. Let me show you another thing. He was so popular that he had a whole workshop working for him. So he would come up with the basic design, he would paint the face, but then he had an expert in trees, he had an expert in fabrics and dresses, so a lot of people would work on these paintings. And so sometimes, see her knee, it's awkward, isn't it? It just is placed strangely. And that's probably because he's just cranking these things out and not doing all of them himself. This is what it looks like hanging in the Legion of Honor, just to give you an idea of the size of it, 7 feet tall. And of course, they weren't meant to hang in museums. They were intended to hang in grand hallways of wealthy people's homes where visitors would come and walk through and be able to see this impressive family and all the wealth of the family. For those of you that have seen the BBC version of Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth goes with her aunt and uncle to Mr. Darcy's house, and he's not supposed to be there, and the housekeeper walks them through, this is the actual set that they use. So the three of them go walking through this, looking at the paintings as they go. Reynolds' big rival was Thomas Gainsborough. They were the same age, but they were just about perfectly opposite. Gainsborough never even went to art school. He didn't go to Rome. He'd never been to Europe. He came up as an engraving apprentice. And he didn't even want to be a portrait painter. He just wanted to paint landscapes. He thought he didn't like high society, but he couldn't be a landscape painter because you couldn't make a living at it there then. Landscape painting in all of Europe was considered an amateur level art, not like history painting or portrait painting. So he just couldn't make a living. He would do it on the side himself. This is an example of one of his, and in those days they didn't have the idea of plein air painting, going out and actually looking at the landscape. He would make little scenes, like a little miniature scene with broccoli for trees and moss and things like that, and then he would paint that. And you can see, so remember how Reynolds was dressed like Rembrandt. He just surrounds himself with foliage. That's his main interest. And then this is one of his landscapes that he did make in his free time. You can see, we'll see this in his portraits too. He has this very feathery way that he paints the trees that's real distinct. And he tends to have them do what these trees are doing, kind of reach in toward each other, which frames the picture, but also gives the trees the sense of almost a human life, as if they have a relationship with each other. So here's a painting he did when he was 20 years old, just 20 years old. He's starting to think, I've got to start doing some portrait paintings if I'm going to make a living. So he made a painting of this couple. You can see it looks kind of, he doesn't look very professional yet, does he? And this is huge. This is always at the National Gallery in London. So, and it's odd because it isn't just their portrait, half of it is a landscape. Probably because he wanted to do that, but there's another reason. This is a young couple, and he is showing the single most important thing you could possibly own in England, and that is land. What everybody wanted to be was a member of the landed gentry. And what that means is that you have enough land that you do not have to work it. You can live off the rents from it. So the people who were gentry would look down on farmers, for example, no matter how much land they had. A farmer could have lots and lots of land and quite a bit of money. But if they were in charge of running that land and planning it, if they were running that, forget it. That was considered very low class. And you would remain a member of the gentry. Once your family had that classification, you retained it, even if you became very poor. That was Jane Austen's situation. Her family had had land in the past, but through the generations, her father had not inherited anything. He was a minister, a clergyman, and they lived, so they didn't have money, but she and her brothers had that classification. She was considered a lady, and her brothers were considered gentlemen. There's another clue here, even if you couldn't see the land, that everybody would have known they were members of the gentry. And it has to do with him. Any ideas? No, not the shoes, although they are nice shoes. It's the shotgun and the bird dog. Only gentry could hunt on the land, which is anybody else, anybody who wasn't a lady or a gentleman who didn't hunt on their own land was poaching and would be sent to prison. So now he's tried in his first formal portrait. Now he's about 25 years old, and he's painting his best friend. You can already see that his gift is not for that Roman, the classical stuff. He's good at a likeness and capturing the essence of a person. Like this guy, you can just, he just kind of looks like a good guy. He's a hearty eater. His face, he's got a little humor in his eyes and his mouth. And then there's that dog. How does that dog feel about him? The dog just loves him. And we are intended to see him through the eyes of that dog with respect and affection. But I don't know how well you can see this, but do you see the tree over on the side? It's this intertwining. He always is interested in that landscape and what it's doing. He's painted the tree beautifully. He's pulled our eye way, way, way back through the landscape. Just by having that little tiny white triangle that's a house back there, that white in the dark makes our eye go there. So again, he's showing us that land. This is his most famous painting, The Blue Boy. I've figured out that I think everybody 60 and over has seen it a million times, and anybody under that has never seen it before. Did you know this painting? It's because in the 1920s, this painting sold to Henry Huntington in California for the highest price that had ever been paid for a painting ever. So it was in all the newspapers. Everybody knew who this painting was, what this painting was. And it's now in Pasadena at the Huntington Library. So what he is doing is really original, the way he's painting here. This boy, by the way, is wearing a costume. He's going to a costume party, is why he's wearing this outfit from probably 200 years earlier. So here, the critics who saw this, they were just fascinated because, like the Impressionists, up close, this just looks like a chaos of brushstrokes, but then you move back and it dissolves into believable looking blue satin. So that's kind of rough, but then his face is painted very, very solidly. It doesn't have any of that brushstroke. You've got two things going on here. So in an old master style for that face, which just gives the painting a lot of dynamism. This is probably Gainsborough's greatest masterpiece. This is at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., where he's painted Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who was a famous soprano of the day, a real popular, and her husband was the most famous playwright of the time. So he's painted her outside, of course, on a windy day, but he has really integrated her into this landscape. Everything she's wearing is blowing, isn't it? Just like the wind. And then her hair is mimicked by that tree up above her. It's almost as if she's part of the landscape. You see those trees reaching in toward each other, again, encircling her. And, you know, as I said, her clothes, the way he's painted that diaphanous scarf, and everything is kind of moving and blowing around that very solid and steady face that has just a touch of melancholy. It's interesting, to me at least, to compare the way French and English paint. First of all, the French have this outside idea, but French painters made their women look much more decorative. The English painters tend to make the women look intelligent. Wouldn't you say she does? And more serious as human beings. So, would Jane Austen have known about Reynolds and Gainsborough? Absolutely. As I said, she went twice a year. She never missed the Royal Academy, and they were written about in the papers. The newspapers were constantly critiquing artists and their work, and her family was very loved to read and was always really up on everything that was going on. So we know for a fact that she came to, in 1813, she came to the Royal Academy and would have seen this exhibition. And what's so interesting about that is that she had just published Pride and Prejudice. Everybody was reading that book. It was just the hit of the summer. And she would have been wandering around with these people. She would have looked dowdy. Her niece said that she always looked kind of dowdy. She wasn't fashionable. And everybody was dying to know who she was, but nobody would have recognized her because, of course, her name wasn't even on the books. Her first book, Sense and Sensibility, a novel by a lady. Second book, Pride and Prejudice, by the author of Sense and Sensibility. So when she died, her father, it was in the works that her name was going to start appearing on those books, but she died before it happened. That Prince Regent knew who she was, and so did Sir Walter Scott, one of the great writers of that time. They actually had a deal with the publisher that they could get her books early on. The prince was dying to meet her, but she didn't like him. He was famously a drunk and a really irresponsible person, and she refused to go meet him. By the way, the few things we know about her, we know so little about her because she asked her sister to burn her letters, to burn everything. She would have written hundreds and hundreds of letters between herself and her sister every time she was gone. But she asked her to burn everything before she died, when she knew she was dying. So here, Gainsborough had painted Mrs. Sheridan 10 years earlier when she was Miss Elizabeth Linley. And so I want to show you the difference in these hairstyles, what happened in just 10 years. On the left there, that hairstyle is called the poof. And it's a really tall hairstyle. You would tease your own hair up, straight up, and then put on a wig that was made of a wire armature, and then horsehair, human hair, cotton, all stuffed in there, and then held together by pomatum, which was wax, but mostly lard. And then pull this long piece down here, and then you'd have to stay like that, keep it like that. It was so much work for at least a week or two. So these women had to sleep sitting up. They got to be so tall, these poofs, that the women they couldn't sit in their carriage without their hair, so they'd have to kneel in the carriage or stick their head out the window. And then, you know, they manufactured at this time, you'll see these sometimes in antique things, these long scratchers that they could reach in and scratch, because all sorts of little things would start living in there. There's a famous letter, an English woman writing to her niece that the lady in front of her in church had this little mouse that kept peeping out. First the head, then the tail. Then in the 1780s, the style changed, and this is called, the English ladies called this the hedgehog, because it's not so tall on top anymore. It's flatter on top and frizzed out more to the sides, but then with this piece still coming down. So these styles are not coming from England. Where are they coming from? And from who in particular? That's right. They're coming from Marie Antoinette in France. And here she is in the 1770s with her pouf. This is a very tiny pouf for her. This is an official portrait, so she had to look dignified. And then in the 80s with the hedgehog, and the real reason the hedgehog came about was that she lost a lot of hair when she finally started having children, and she couldn't pull off the pouf anymore. She had to wear a hat. So that's why it got flatter and wider. The British press loved to do cartoons about the French coming to England. This is actually a French cartoon, so I think they're kind of laughing at these stupid Englishmen that don't even know that's hair. The funniest thing is that the men have poofs. Well, a little bit. Yeah, they did a little bit. Maybe like this. Yeah, a few. So, was this painted in the 1770s or the 1780s? Yeah, it was. She's wearing a pouf. It was painted in 1779, so the very end of the pouf. 2 test questions about this. Do you think it was painted by Gainsborough or Reynolds? And do you think it was painted in the 1770s or the 1780s? Why do you think Gainsborough?
Because their faces aren't, it's just the same style as the one before. Like their faces just, the other artists, their faces are a lot more wide, they're a lot more.
Their faces are thinner. Anything else? We've got that tree, those feathery trees, and the way they're reaching toward each other. And something I forgot to tell you, Gainsborough loved to put dogs in the paintings, loved to. He would do a lot of portraits just of a dog, his friend's dog. So that's another thing. And then 1780s or 1790s? Excuse me, 1770s or 1780s? Absolutely. And see, even so, not just Marie Antoinette wore hats with the hedgehog. Everyone did. So this is a wedding portrait by Gainsborough. You're right, and they are 21 years old. This couple, which looks funny to us because we read that powdered. You know, it's just the style to wear to powder your hair, but to us it looks like gray or white hair. So. So this is what the style would have been, 1780s. Jane Austen was born in 1775. This was when she was a really little girl, but the style that her mother would have had. So women's dresses that have a natural waist, expensive fabrics, silks and brocades, and then the gentleman would wear very expensive fabrics as well, brocades, velvets, silks, and they would expensive lace. They both have on expensive lace. She's wearing her hedgehog, and he is wearing either a wig or his own hair pulled back, and held with a bow. 1785. So the change in the Regency, which is, not that much later, is just absolutely dramatic. The first thing that happened was that there was a tax on hair powder, and everybody stopped using it. That was in the 1790s. Men and women, except for older men, stopped using hair powder altogether. And then they would cut their hair amazingly short, really short in front, like you see here, but then with a little longer piece in the back that they would then put up in just a very small bun. The dresses changed from a natural waist to this empire waist, and they were made often of muslin, which is a very inexpensive fabric, extremely lightweight, so that they're almost always wearing some kind of a shawl. Here's another example. Surprisingly low cut to us, very, very low cut. And so there's that muslin again. So these are coming out of France too, these styles. after the French Revolution, where if you wore a brocade after the French Revolution, that would be enough to send you to the guillotine in France. So this is a copy of their idea of what ancient Greek dresses would have looked like. There are statues that they kind of look like this. And then the muslin's so inexpensive, kind of a fabric of the people. So this is an actual, so the French Revolution was 1789. So this is a French painting. By 1799, the styles had already completely changed like this. So this is a mother and daughter. The daughter is wearing the very lightweight thin, and the mother, because she's older, can't pull that off. So she's wearing a heavier dress. She does have on velvet, which is interesting. This is a family who really should have been guillotined, but the father was so clever about how he maneuvered the family after the revolution that they survived, and survived very well, as you can see here. There's that hairdo again on the daughter, trying to look Greek. So this is a shot from the BBC miniseries. Have all of you seen this? Okay, so you know exactly. This is accurate in every detail. So here are the girls in their inexpensive cotton day dresses. So just exactly what we were talking about, the same exact hairstyles we were talking about. And this, of course, is the first line from Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And so because this looking for husbands is usually, I think it's the theme of every single one of her books, the main theme. And of course she uses so much humor about it, but it was actually really serious, because if you didn't get married, there was no alternative. That was the only career you could possibly have. If you didn't marry, you couldn't go get an apartment in London with a girlfriend. You would live with your family for your entire life. If your parents died, like Jane Austen's did, you'd live with a brother. Your status in the family would be very, very low. Remember when Lydia comes home after running off with the soldier and just almost ruining the family, and she comes home and is so proud of herself because she literally gets to sit at the most important spot at the dinner table, and that is a true thing simply because she was married. And so Jane Austen was in this position of, you're kind of the butt of jokes, the maiden aunt, that kind of thing. Never the mistress of your own home, ever. So for men, it wasn't that much easier for gentlemen. The eldest son inherited everything. This was the law because they wanted these big estates to remain intact, and so that the aristocracy could manage the wealthy families, is what it comes down to, instead of them being broken up into so many different pieces. So the eldest son inherited everything, and the other brothers had to make their way. They might get a tiny inheritance. So they had to figure out how to get a job. And there were only a few jobs that were acceptable for a gentleman. I'll go into that again in just a second. First, let me talk about the Regency style for men. So again, no more brocade, no more long hair, no more lace. The Regency style, this gentleman's suit is the precursor of our men's suits, where it's not the fabric so much, but it's the tailoring that indicates quality. A beautifully cut coat. So this would be, he's wearing a cutaway jacket, so it's short here and then with tails in the back, long in the back, and then a waistcoat, which we would call a vest, sometimes with buttons usually, sometimes double-breasted. And then the only part of this outfit that would be individual would be the way you would tie this cravat. Men cut their hair really short as well, no powder, and they liked to wear it messed up because it looked romantic. So here's Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy in that outfit, although he does have on a brocade waistcoat. His hair's messy too. So the options for a gentleman, second, third, fourth, fifth son. You could become a minister, which required no religious feeling or calling whatsoever, and you could and came with a house. The rectory, I guess is what, I can't remember what it's called, the parish house, which is what Jane Austen's family lived in. They lived in a parish house of her father's. Oh, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins that's what he was. He was a gentleman, and he was a minister, and he lived in the nicest of parish houses, the parish house of Lady Kathryn Zupsic. Is he one of the most hilarious characters you've ever seen anywhere? They could be a lawyer. Was acceptable. All that wealth that was being made up north, they couldn't participate in that at all. That was considered low, running a factory or even being an entrepreneur up there. So they didn't get to partake of that wealth. Isn't that just amazing? Trade. They were in the trades. But the best choice, the most popular choice for younger brothers was to go into the military. And as I said, the army, here you see one of the red coats of the army, but it was the Navy that for a smart, ambitious son was the best choice. The British Royal Navy was the best Navy in the world, and this is, again, so hard for us to believe, but it was the only branch of military in all of Europe that the men were promoted based on merit. Otherwise, you went in as an officer if you were a gentleman, and your rank was based on your family's standing. Sometimes you could pay your way up to the top, but in the Navy, you had to earn your rank. So this is the most famous, beloved naval hero in British history, and Captain Horatio Nelson. Here you see him close to me where he's lost an eye and an arm in battle. And his father was a very modest country parson. In Persuasion, Captain Wentworth, you could become wealthy in the Navy because the British government would pay them for the booty they would capture from enemy ships. So, for example, Captain Wentworth in Persuasion appears on the scene after 9 years in the Royal Navy, and he is wealthy just because of that, because he's a captain in the Navy. The enlisted men were on the opposite end of the scale. They, of course, were not gentlemen. They were the lowest strata of society, usually. Lots of times the army would just kind of make a sweep of homeless people, and that's who became the army soldiers. Lord Wellington, who finally defeated Napoleon, said that he managed to do that with an army that was composed of the scum of the earth, which is just so horrible, But that is how they felt about this group of people who were in the army. So here's a painting. Let's see, it's called The Dead Soldier by Joseph Wright of Derby. It's a big painting at the Legion of Honor. So you've got two scenes here. In the background, this is in the United States, America, it would have been then. In the colonies, the British are fighting there. So you can see them lined up in formation, all the red coats, and then you've got this other scene inside the tent where the soldier had died and this young woman is left alone with a baby. In those days, the women and children could get on the boat and go across the ocean with the soldiers, and they would follow them from camp to camp. They'd kind of take care of the men. They'd cook, they'd sew, things like that. They're called camp followers. Most of them of this class level were not actually married at this time. But if the soldier died, as long as the soldier was alive, the woman and children would receive half rations from the British government. But if they died, they received nothing. So here she is abandoned in a foreign country with a baby. This artist was a progressive, and he has that baby looking out at us, asking what is going to become of me, because again, unbelievably, the upper classes had no concern at all about the fate of people of this class, or any interest in a soldier and the secondary victims of war. So this is when that is starting to change, with the idea of humanism, the idea that all human beings have worth. Jane Austen, her writing, she actually pretty much accepts the status quo of society. It's the next generation, Charles Dickens, that is going to pick up on these ideas and show them in their novels. So a lot of people, everybody wondered who was writing these novels, and a lot of people thought it had to be a man, because Jane Austen wrote so well about men. She could write about the Navy, she could write about just business, everything to do with men. That's because she had all these brothers, and they had all these different professions. One of her brothers, the top left there, was actually adopted by distant relatives who didn't have an heir. So he actually lived in a magnificent estate and was wealthy. That's how she was able to write about people like Lady Kathryn Zupsic and Mr. Darcy. Two of her brothers down here on the bottom became admirals in the Navy, and another was a parson, and another had kind of a businessman-like job. So just a couple words about houses in this time. Jane Austen, again, she is really disciplined about how much description she gives us. It tends to be not much. She doesn't tend to describe anything that isn't germane to the action of the novel. So when she talks about houses, she will generally say they're just old-fashioned or modern. This would be old-fashioned in the Regency. So it's just kind of a mishmash all put together. That is modern. Again, classical. I thought I had a picture of that. Well, if you can envision the Parthenon in Greece, it's that same thing, that triangular pediment up at the top, and then rows of columns like this, perfectly symmetrical, big windows to let in the light, and positioned high on the land someplace so that it can look out over this beautiful landscape. Have any of you been to this garden? Sometimes I have not either, but sometimes people in the audience have. So the land surrounding the house would be called the park. And the English, this is interesting, when it comes to landscape, the English are not copying the French. They're rebelling against them, because this is a French garden where, this is Versailles, but the French idea is that man is dominant over nature. Every blade of grass is bending to the will of man. But the English idea, which of course we've picked up in the United States, is that this garden probably costs as much to make and maintain, but the idea is that it would look natural. And there are wonderful things written about the philosophies behind these gardens, that you're intended to, when you walk through them, you're intended to have an experience. So that maybe, I can't remember where the house is, I think it's over here, but you'd walk along the grass and go across that little bridge, and you'd look over to that miniature Roman temple over there, and then you'd walk into the woods and you'd go. It's kind of a metaphor for life. You go in the dark, you come back in the light. Sometimes it's a little harder to walk. You catch a glimpse of where you're trying to go, and then you lose sight of it again. Just such a lovely idea. Lots of these little garden sculptures, but just looking kind of worn. This particular little temple, if you have seen the Keira Knightley version of Pride and Prejudice, they have their big love scene. They get caught, their first love scene, they get caught in the rain and take shelter in this exact location in this. There's Keira Knightley. My daughter's lit teacher calls this the skinny version. And there's Matthew McFadden, which I was reading this website. I think it was the Jane Austen Society, actually, that they were arguing which Pride and Prejudice was best, and the young women were all saying, this one, and this one young woman said, he is the swooniest swoon ever swooned. So, as you know, that scene where she arrives with her aunt and uncle, who you see there in the back, at Darcy's house, it was common, this was a thing they did in those days. If you owned a big estate, the public was welcome to come tour it. So that's how they were able to go in there without, she didn't even tell the housekeeper that she knew him. The only reason Elizabeth went there was that she knew for a fact he was not going to be there. And then, of course, he shows up, which is so embarrassing for her. But before he showed up, she had walked through the grounds with her aunt and uncle. And she writes about that quite a bit, that experience, how beautiful it was, how beautifully planned it was. So she kind of has this experience and that English appreciation of nature. It's one of the things that changes her mind about him, that not just that he's wealthy, but that a garden like that would have to come from someone good. At this time in the Enlightenment, nature is associated with goodness. So, again, going back to this, now we know she isn't just wandering around outside. She is in her own modern landscape garden and has stopped at one of these fixtures for a minute and is having her portrait painted. So I'm just going to leave you with these few images of paintings from the time of Jane Austen, some from the Regency era and some not. So what I hope people get out of this is, first of all, some background that makes the novels more interesting, but also when you go to museums, so many big museums do have these British galleries. I hope that you will enjoy looking at the paintings a lot more as well. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Comments?
My mother was a literature teacher. This is just my favorite. It's also considered the first modern novel. She was the first modern writer because she did her descriptions through talking rather than just sitting there describing things. Everything was done with dialect.
That's interesting. Do you want me to repeat that? I'm just going to repeat this because it's been being recorded and they can't hear it. The comment is that this was the first modern novel. She was the first modern novelist because she didn't just describe things. We learn things through dialogue. That's a really wonderful comment. And I actually did not know that she was considered the first modern novelist. Any other comments? Had you seen this art before? No? I used to really not like this era very much, but now I like it a lot. So if you don't have more comments, I'm just going to give you a little look at what is coming next on February 9th. I'll be talking about the artistic vision of Gustav Klimt, who of course was a Viennese artist who was painting in his own very unique and modern style around the turn of the century. So here I'm just going to flip through some of his work. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So I hope you'll have a chance to come to that. He is a fascinating artist. One thing, though, that we have to get the word out, this is adults, for adults. It's very sexy artwork.
What is the portrait of Jane Austen? The one that
I don't know. It's just, her sister did it. Somebody has colored it in. It was just a sketch. For some reason, this is what you see in...
Sister did the portrait?
Yes, her sister Cassandra just did a sketch of her. That's the only thing we have. When she was, I think Jane Austen was 30, no, she died at 35, something like that. And that's the only image we have. There are others they think might be her, but they don't know. And I don't know where it is. I think it's just little.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks so much, Kathryn.